as always, if you have any questions about the NDRC, please be sure to send them to resilientrecovery@hud.gov. That includes questions we couldn't get to today, or maybe a question that you wanted to ask the HUD staff privately. So on that note, I'm going to turn it over to Jessie Handforth Kome from HUD.
Hi, this is Jessie Handforth Kome, Deputy Director of Office of Block Grant Assistance, and I'm here with Todd Richardson and Meg Barclay and Lynsey Johnson and Duncan Yetman. We're all part of the team working on the National Disaster Resilience Competition. And today we're going to talk about the Unmet Recovery Needs Threshold Criteria and have a question and answer session. So what we're going to cover today is a brief review of the Unmet Recovery Needs Threshold Criteria, which we've already had a webinar on back in September on launch day. Was it September? Yep. Wow. And then we're going to have questions and answers. If you want to start sending in your questions at any time, Meg is being our sorter of questions, and she will be able to take them and get them queued up for when we're done with the presentation. We also have additional resources, as you're probably aware, over on the HUD Exchange, where you can pick up information about the National Disaster Resilience Competition on resilience in general, and CDBG-DR, get ideas and examples, and you can also, as again, always send questions to the resilientrecovery@hud.gov mailbox, which means me, Meg, and Jen. Okay, so there are 3 thresholds: most impacted, most distressed, and unmet recovery need thresholds that are statutory and linked to the source of our funding. So you have to get through these thresholds to get into the competition. Most impacted is about where the disaster did damage, the declared disaster. Meg cursed me. She told me I hadn't coughed in a while. Here I go again. And she's making faces at me now. All right, and how much damage was done. On distress, we're talking about the characteristics, for the most part, the characteristics of the most impacted area that exacerbated the impact of the disaster and made it more difficult to recover. And today what we're going to be talking about, because we talked about the first 2 Tuesday, we're going to be talking about what need resulting from the disaster remains in the most impacted area that cannot be met with available resources. The reason that we put in these 2 additional webinars is that there were so many questions raised about Appendix G through the submissions for the 45-day optional reviews, and we're trying to get out there ahead of it. You should know that we also have a technical amendment to Appendix G of the NOFA that is coming, because we discovered, and some alert grantees also pointed out, some errors and omissions in Appendix G, and we will give answers today pretty much based on what we know is coming, but they're technical amendments such as places where we forgot to say, for example, or left out a semicolon that our lawyers tell us changes the meaning of the sentence from what we intended. And we're working on getting that out as fast as we can. It's written. We just need to get the signatures. It will load up at grants.gov, and we will send a note out to the mailing list so you'll know about it right away. Okay, so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Todd Richardson, who's going to tell us all about the Unmet Recovery Needs Threshold.
All right, so I want to reiterate that this is a fairly simple concept that's somewhat hard to meet. And the simple concept is you had a presidentially declared disaster in a defined area, and that you need to show for that defined area that you still have damage and that you don't have enough resources to recover from that damage. That's required because of these statements in the statutory language. The first is that these funds have to be used for necessary expenses, so a cost item related to your long-term disaster recovery. And the second is that this has to be something that you don't already have resources that could be acquired through FEMA or the Army Corps of Engineers, or if you've already received CDBG disaster recovery funds, other CDBG disaster recovery funds you've received. So there has to be a gap here. So that's where the unmet piece comes in. Next slide. So the second part of this is that when we made our formula allocations, generally those occurred at a relatively soon after the disasters that we were funding. And at that time, we had some data from our partners at FEMA and the Small Business Administration that we could make some decisions about what damage was probably not going to be covered by FEMA and Small Business Administration. But today it's December 2014. All of these disasters are at least a year old. Several of them are 2 to 3 years old, which means we do not have any current data on what your recovery needs are from these disasters. So we need you to tell us. And that's why we're running this competition, is so you can tell us what your continuing recovery needs are and show to us that you don't have enough resources to address them. Next slide. A lot of folks had trouble with the sort of target area issues that were in the Appendix G. So this is to clarify what we did cover already in Most Impacted a couple days ago. The key here is if your county is already a most impacted county as determined by HUD, then you can present data and identify that most impacted county. However, if it was not a county that was previously designated by HUD as most impacted, then we're going to ask you to have to demonstrate data at a smaller geography, a sub-county level. And that can be very tiny, up to different sizes. So, for example, it could be a block group, it could be a census tract, it could be an aggregation of census tracts, it can be a census place, but it cannot be the whole county to be able to qualify. It must be within a county that was declared in 2011, 2012, or 2013 as a presidentially declared disaster area. And it needs to be the same area that you have already identified as most impacted and distressed earlier in your response to Appendix G. Next slide. It's very important. So this issue about most impacted is what is sort of driving all of this. Not every place that had a disaster is going to qualify for these funds. You have to demonstrate that, in fact, you had some very significant level of damage associated with this presidentially declared disaster that has some gap that needs to be addressed with these funds. That's the law calls for most impacted and distressed, and we have to discern that. Next slide. This is a repetition of the areas I just went through on what a sub-county level could be. And you'll note we keep repeating this because we saw this several times in the letters we received, some difficulty with these areas. And also, it's because people had difficulty with these areas, we realized part of that was our fault. We had some drafting technical issues that we are resolving in the document that we're going to be putting out there in terms of revised Appendix G, as Jessie noted. Next slide. So there were a number of sort of questions and answers about this issue about sub-county levels. Can an applicant make a most impacted address showing for every sub-county area within a county that separately addresses the data for each and every sub-county area? So, for example, you can add it up to county. Okay, an applicant, you can read the question here in the Q&A.
You know, basically, this is for most impacted and distressed. The answer is that you can't aggregate, but for unmet recovery needs, as Todd's going to, point out, you may aggregate. In fact, we probably recommend that you aggregate. So that tripped up a lot of people. So we're going to get this Q&A out formally. This is what we intended, and we're just not sure it was super clear to everybody that applied. A few places got it, and most places missed it.
All right, next slide. So for the responses here, as you know, there's the Phase 1 response, and then there's going to be a Phase 2. So response if you pass through that Phase 1 set area. This notes the difference between Phase 1 and Phase 2. Phase 1 is important for you to identify the target areas and demonstrate the needs. This is a threshold criteria. You can't get to Phase 2 unless you pass this threshold criteria. And you'll note with Phase 2, you can make some changes to the areas in Phase 2. Let's get into the details a little bit about what it takes in each of the different categories here.
Because a lot of the questions we noted did have to do with the specific data that we asked for, and people didn't necessarily read it as stringently as we hoped, you know, and give us the exact data source we asked for.
All right. So for housing, in the case of housing, you're going to have to show that some people still have either people are still displaced from this disaster, or that there are homes that are unrepaired as associated with this disaster that still need recovery assistance. And we've sort of outlined a couple of different pathways for that. One is to use your emergency management staff to identify folks that are still displaced from the disaster. And the other pathway is simply, and this doesn't have to be scientific, but in the target area, drive through the areas that were hit, identify homes that appear to still be damaged from the disaster, and survey at least 9 of those folks to see that, in fact, this was from the disaster and that they still have recovery needs that's not being covered by any other assistance. So that gets you the house. If you're going to do the housing path, that's the way you can address your housing path. For those, there is a slightly different approach for the folks that got CDBG disaster recovery funds already and are running a housing program already. For those folks, they're going to need to show that they've got a wait list that's longer than the funding they have already allocated to address those needs. For folks that have CDBG disaster recovery funds and are not running a housing program currently, and all of their funds are accounted for other activities, they will need to use this method, as I just went through, on either identifying displaced folks or continuing recovery needs.
Right, and one of the things that we saw on specifics is that we did see some windshield surveys. I saw one in particular that did a windshield survey, a windshield, you know, driving around, but they didn't actually tell us that the damage was due to the disaster. And that the households had inadequate resources. We needed all of the boxes checked off to be able to accept the threshold. There's some really good pictures, and it's pretty obvious that the houses are damaged. It didn't say what caused the damage, and we just need that piece.
I was just at there are plenty of homes that are damaged unrelated to disasters. We need to actually tie this back to the disaster.
And this gets to what we were saying on the webinar on Tuesday, that we can't tell your story for you. We can't draw that conclusion. It has to be in black and white in order for us to be able to, you know, look at and document the threshold review results.
Right. A few of you, we're very familiar with your situations in some cases, but by the rules of the Reform Act, we have to treat everybody the same, which means we can only use the information you submit in your application, no matter what else we know.
So next up is infrastructure. You had damaged infrastructure. There's some report. It can be a report from FEMA that shows that there is damage to the property.
We have a comment. You see that?
I can't read that.
We have a comment about the engineering report, whether getting a recertification or an engineering assessment after March 14th is reasonable given funding, that some of them don't have funding to update. So why did we pick March 14th? Because it's 1 year before the submission, the actual submission date. We said 1 year old was reasonable.
Yeah. So you don't have to get it's not necessarily you have to have a totally new engineering report. You just need to have someone say that in fact this is still relevant today. This problem still exists. The repairs haven't been made.
An engineer could recertify or revalidate the existing report without.
Or just in one case, we saw a cover letter from the engineering firm who'd originally submitted. He said this has not been repaired, this work has not been done.
And you have to show on this, we do ask for a little source and use statement because a lot of public infrastructure is certainly can be covered by FEMA, but not all of it. And so we need you to show this is the total cost of this project, this is the amount that's being covered by other sources, this is the amount that's unfunded. And the total amount of unfunded costs for these infrastructure programs, if it's over $400,000, then that gets you qualified as unmet recovery needs.
But we are dropping the sources and use statement requirement on the most impacted.
Yes.
We're only continuing with it. It wasn't supposed to show up in most impacted. It's supposed to be in unmet recovery needs where it is, and that's where we're keeping it.
Right. So we're making another technical correction on most impacted on that front. Economic revitalization. So economic revitalization is a lot like the housing requirement, in that we're looking for you to show to us that there's either businesses that had damage that you can survey the businesses and they can confirm that this is damage from the disaster that they still have recovery needs from, or you can show that, and you have to talk to the businesses again, that they had a reduction in their revenues associated with this disaster that continues to be a problem. And so that's what we're requiring for showing continuing unmet needs on the business side of the house.
And it's, again, not a random sample. This can be a purposive sample.
Yeah, we're just looking to show you, if you meet the, if you got to get the numbers, you got to get the 5 businesses here, and then you're okay on this factor. It only takes 5 businesses. Next slide. Oh, decrease in revenues. So this is sort of showing how do you have fewer employees than the disaster, so you've actually had to lay people off because of this disaster, or do you have less gross revenue associated with this? So this gives you the details, sort of how the boxes you have to check on the economic revitalization. Next slide. Oh, yes. Actually, I will say, go back to that slide, sorry. We know that people are sensitive about their business data, so we do want you to be careful with that and make sure it's not in any public place. And we're just going to use it to ensure that you meet the requirements of the NOFA. Next slide. And finally, environmental degradation. This is similar to the requirement we have for infrastructure. We're looking to say that, so now you will have shown in most impacted that you had environmental degradation. For example, you had a fire that causes watershed problems that might cause a future flood that will cause potential damage to housing businesses. Great. For this purpose, the concern is actually the fire itself, and that there's a cost to rebuild the watershed, and that you have an estimated cost for that, and that estimated cost, less the amount of money you already have to address it, is $400,000.
And this could include plantings, and it's not necessarily that you're going to build a wall to protect your watershed. It could also be a green solution, a green infrastructure solution, or which is planting, or a berm, or you know, whatever you need to do to keep that fire damage from washing downstream in the next flood.
That's right. And so that leads to questions, which is the best part of these webinars. And so we'll look to get your questions now.
So we've already addressed a question that we had in the queue about whether a recent engineering assessment is a reasonable requirement, and explained sort of what we're expecting there. But I don't see any other questions in the queue. Does anyone else have anything else?
Meg, this is George. I just had a question come in the chat that I'm going to send to you that you can read aloud. You should have it in about a second.
Can you describe what you mean by protect your recovery?
Okay, so the easiest way to explain protect your recovery, and this is tying into the economic revitalization aspect of the law more than to any of the other aspects, is you've gone back and you had water and sewer water and sewer system, and sewer is, of course, always on low ground, and you repaired your water and sewer system. There really isn't anything you can do to mitigate it. But if you go off that property and onto some additional space and start building dunes, so that, and then, you know, you're just going to have regular rainfall that's going to wash into your water and sewer and cause you a problem now. Those dunes, that part of it would be an action to protect your recovery. Your recovery isn't going to, you know, last through, you know, 6 weeks without you taking care of providing some additional protection. We're aware that it isn't just damage, and Congress is aware. That's why they put the economic revitalization as, in some ways, a catch-all category. The problem is that we cannot do straight forward-looking mitigation the way the FEMA mitigation program can. You still have to tie back what you're doing to the effects of the disaster you had. We're getting a lot of questions, one of which we just referred to the lawyers. Actually, it came in the mailbox yesterday or the day before, and I've already referred it to the lawyers, about if you have done all of your repairs and you want to go back and elevate the same home, say, or flood-proof businesses that don't have any more repair need or unmet recovery need in the sense that we've been seeing it, can we put those resilient costs in and not view them as purely forward-facing? And I haven't seen the case yet that'll make our lawyers say yes. But if you come to us with an overall proposal that says, we're going to do these recovery things, but they're not going to be effective unless we also do this habitat or this green infrastructure or this flood wall or this whatever, that protects our other recovery actions, we can probably get there. Our problem is once your recovery needs are met, can we double back on the resiliency on the same buildings that were definitely damaged? I'm not really sure where that answer is going to come. And so I would say for phase 1, you should be working really hard on what your overall concept is for your community to be more resilient and really participate in the Rockefeller thing, and I am pushing this answer as hard as I can right now, but I just don't have it yet. And I know this is that certain grantees have been asking this, applicants have been asking this, and I'm got to tell you, I'm working on it. I understand the question, but we had a really strong answer from Congress about whether we could do a peer mitigation program, and the answer was no. So we have to stay in bounds on the law we got on this.
Okay, so this is a question about unmet need. Is the unmet need a direct tie to the most impacted characteristic? For example, there are more than 20 houses seriously damaged in a characteristic of most impacted in the target area. Therefore, the unmet need requires documentation or evidence that provides sufficient evidence to support this. Or, for example, most impacted infrastructure target area, there is an engineering report that estimates repairs at over $2 million that still need to happen. Therefore, that same report can be used to show the funding shortfall of $400,000, and there is inadequate resources to address the shortfall.
So that's a tangled up question. We're still reading carefully here.
Well, the example you'll give, the latter example, which doesn't seem, I thought this question would be mixing and matching. That is, you showed that you are most impacted because you had 20 houses with serious damage, and then you say for unmet recovery needs, but we have an infrastructure project that has this much remaining damage. That's fine.
Actually, to get through threshold.
To get through threshold, that is fine. Your example here is also fine, where you say that you have an engineering report that shows that there's damage of $2 million, and you also have a sources and uses statement that shows that you don't have, that you have less than, or you have more than 400,000 that's not covered. That's also fine.
Well, the same engineering report will work, but you have to add a sources and uses for your unmet recovery need. The mixing and matching, by the way, only works if it's for the same area. You have to get one area through every single hoop. So we'll say that you hit threshold and we'll score your application. But the area can say most affected housing, it's a low-mod area, but we have this infrastructure unmet recovery need. You can do that as long as it's the same area. You just have to hit every one of most impacted, one characteristic of distress, and one characteristic for unmet recovery need. And we actually saw quite a lot of that mixing and matching, actually much more than I was expecting, which is kind of interesting.
Okay, this is another question, long question. I'm going to go ahead and read it. Can unmet need be a problem that presented itself? For example, there was an issue that was uncovered during the disaster. Therefore, this manifested unmet need relates to the disaster, but there is no documentation or evidence showing funding shortfalls due to the fact that there can be no documentation about that problem in the most impacted requirements and or in the unmet need threshold requirements. For example, we had a fire, we didn't have water, we couldn't put out the fire. Manifested unmet need is a water reservoir.
Oh, this is a good question. So, you had a fire. The fire caused damage. What damage did the fire cause? That it might be an environmental, it could possibly be housing or infrastructure also on most impacted. But I mean, we're getting a lot of fire questions, and I'm assuming that this fire is a major. We have a few major declared disasters that are fires, and we're not talking about a fire declaration. We're talking about a major fire declaration, which means it damaged the environment somewhere, because major fires do damage the environment a lot, whether or not it burned down houses or not. There are people who specialize in estimating the amount of environmental damage caused by fires, and you need to find them. My understanding is a lot of them are somehow affiliated with the Department of Agriculture, but I'm sure states understand this better than I do. If you come to us and say, we had a fire that caused this much environmental damage, and you can show us on distress that you hit one of the distress factors, which is going to probably be environmental degradation, and probably documented with the same study or report that you use for the environment, the most impacted, then you have to do an estimate of the damage to the environment and what it would cost you to. Most of the times with fires, my understanding is most of the time the repair involves some form of planting or soil breakup and soil replacement in order to keep to stabilize. But it depends if you're in California on slopes or not.
But going back to this question, this specific question here, there was concern that you couldn't put out the fire because you didn't have enough wire. Well, the fire is done.
Yeah.
So your unmet need is either that you need to do something to, say, replant the forest to protect the reservoir, or the reservoir was damaged, and you have some evidence to show that there's damage to the reservoir, a cost estimate that.
But in this case, they didn't have a reservoir at all.
That's the unmet need that they're saying that they have.
And that's their recovery plan.
I see.
It was exposed by the fact that they didn't have enough water to put the fire out.
That's not the unmet need.
That's not an unmet need.
In regular CDBG-DR, we would definitely let you at least partially fund a water reservoir. They serve a lot of other purposes besides just putting out fires. So it's always tricky to attribute the part of it that really belongs to the fire damage, how much would you need it, and all that. Getting at it is more of a question. I would actually tackle it almost through an unmet recovery need. It would work through the economic revitalization piece. I mean, if you don't have a water reservoir and you're in fire country, you're going to have a problem with insurance. And we allow indirect. So if you had a major fire and you didn't have a water reservoir and you're at risk for more fires, is your insurance going up? This is a very interesting question. We would allow it in the main CDBG-DR program to allow you to build the water reservoir. But we didn't construct the
as
competition.
as a project,
as a project, but not as an unmet recovery need.
But it's not one. It's not a factor for this
for just unmet recovery need.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. So the short answer is this is not an unmet recovery need.
Yes.
Is that right?
That's correct.
I'm not sure that the need for a water reservoir isn't an unmet need. We're going to have to talk about this.
We'll do an FAQ for you.
We will. This one's going to take some thinking about.
You stumped us.
It's not about damage. You did stump us. Thank you.
Okay. Another question from the stumper.
Oh,
Can you please
no.
Thank
clarify?
you. That's somebody who likes to type.
Can you please clarify the tie back to the disaster threshold as it relates to the resiliency threshold and unmet? Is there a resiliency threshold? Oh yeah, there is. And unmet need. How can a community implement resiliency when you are addressing an unmet recovery need? Therefore, do project proposals need only to logically tie back to the disaster and reasonably and not address the specific unmet need? For example, this tree burned down, create a project that addresses trees in general burning down, but we don't have to actually address that specific tree.
Yeah, that's kind of an interesting one also, and clearly our stumper likes sending us stumpers. The deal is that tieback is just a small part of some disaster recovery projects. So if you, for example, have the 5 businesses that you found that are out of business or have decreased revenues, do you want to get them back where they were the day before the disaster, or do you want to position yourself for a more prosperous future? What we say is, once you have established that those businesses lost their revenue or were damaged by the effects of the disaster, you can then look at those businesses and do the assistance that you need to do to not only get them undamaged again, get them to where they were the day before the disaster, but turn around and position them so that they will help drive your community forward in a way that fosters your economic revitalization. We say specifically in the NOFA that you don't have to rehab a house, you can include resilience costs in the cost of rehabbing a house or rehabbing a piece of infrastructure. You can, if you lost a whole bunch of seashore, for example, if a big nor'easter clawed away your shore and you now have a lot more houses in the floodplain, you can run a buyout program in that floodplain. Those places were damaged by suddenly economically damaged by suddenly having to have insurance, and they're in floodplains and they're not elevated and they're at risk. So those are effects of a disaster. So yeah, the resilience is what happens after you establish tieback. Tieback just means that when your eventual project is going to meet these most impacted and distressed and unmet recovery need thresholds, the kernel of it, the very core of it. And it may be all that you decide to do with this money, but we're encouraging you to think about, while you're doing that, addressing the damage, go bigger.
Okay, so the next, I'm a little worried that we're getting into the project realm again, which is really tempting when you're talking about a competition. But
projects will not be responsive to phase 1.
Right. I want to make sure that we get back onto the how do you meet this incredibly difficult to meet threshold so that the rest of your application.
Plenty of people get through unmet recovery need.
A lot of people didn't. So can you explain again what can be aggregated and what cannot? Can I aggregate census tracts to get to $2 million for most impacted for infrastructure, or does the $2 million need to be in each census tract?
The $2 million is in each census tract because you're talking about most impacted. What you can do is, if you have established that you had $2 million in impact in each of 5 census tracts, but each one of those only has $100,000 in unmet recovery need remaining, when you get to unmet recovery need, you can add up all those $100,000 and get $500,000. So most impacted is you have to be hit hard in a sub-county area if it's not one of the nationally most impacted counties that we identified. That's what the $2 million is for the most impacted, and that's saying that you were just hit really hard. Unmet recovery need is an aggregation across all of the impacts that you've identified of the total sum of unmet need dollar amount left, right? Did I get that right? I'm asking Todd now. That's what we were saying.
So sorry about that. A little clarification on that. So let's say you have an area and you've got, so we'll do most impacted first.
Well, first, the census tracts in my example would not have been contiguous.
Right. So in Jessie's example, they wouldn't have been contiguous. Let's say you have contiguous census tracts, however, for your most impacted area. If you have contiguous census tracts, those can qualify for your most impacted $2 million. You've got 3 census tracts
in the same county.
In the same county, in that same sub-county area, then those could be combined together to get your most impacted. And then you have another census tract that's not connected, that's over an area, it's still in the same county, that's a little bit a ways away, and that also has $2 million in infrastructure needs, say. But you don't. But you can combine all of those together for the unmet recovery needs to get to your $400,000 threshold.
But not for most impacted.
So I'm sorry that that's a little unclear.
It's because places, we're allowing places by place name are sometimes made of a few, several census tracts that all relate to each other. Again, that we explained on the most impacted and distressed one that the way we calculated out or figured out the thresholds for most impacted is related to being in a sub-county area. It's calibrated to that. So that's why we're being fairly picky about the amount of need and the sub-county area and how you can add things up and not add things. What's the next question?
So do cost estimates have to be verified or done by a third party?
We didn't specify third party, done or verified. We just specified, like for the engineering report, we'd like an engineer to do it. Third party is, of course, the gold standard. But we are trying to set this bar lower than gold standard. We'd like to see you get into this competition.
Yeah, we want something that's achievable here. That you just need to demonstrate that you actually have had significant damage and have unmet recovery needs.
Right, and it can't just be a simple assertion. If you want to say, I, the local government, estimate that this cost is this, you need to tell us how you estimated the cost. If you went out to and we get you submit as your documentation a report from a contractor, economic development firm that does these kind of estimates all the time, that's not a simple assertion. That's an actual report that you commission. Either way, though, just tell us how you built up the cost estimate. There are definitely county public works departments all over the country are perfectly capable of working up cost estimates without contracting out. So just tell us how you figured it out.
When we do say engineering report, though, we do want to...
When we say engineering report, we need a report.
Engineering report on it, or say it was done by an engineer.
Yes, prepared by, right, with all of those initials.
Yeah.
To go after an engineer's name.
Okay, so the next question is if they successfully meet a threshold under one category, for example, infrastructure, can there include other categories, for example, housing, in applications?
You can include all the categories you want. We actually had a couple of attempts at hitting every single combination of boxes. Nobody successfully did it, but there were some very, very impressive attempts at doing it. What we said was you need to get at least one area through most impacted and distressed and unmet recovery needs to get scored. But anything that you want to eventually expend grant funds on is going to have to be in a tied-back project that meets all of those thresholds. So that's one of the reasons that there's an allowance between Phase 1 and Phase 2 for updates. Once you finally extract a project out of your Phase 1 planning, you may need to go back and work on tieback. So the answer is yes. What's the next?
This is a follow-up from the power grid question from Tuesday, but it's related to unmet needs, so I'm going to allow it in this portion. They're trying to understand if making a power system more resilient now, one that may have been damaged in the disaster, after the power has been turned back on, if that can qualify as an unmet need.
Sorry about that.
Yes, Todd and I keep having sidebars over these because these are good questions, and we're having to make sure we agree.
So the answer to that is no. You've essentially already recovered in this circumstance, and so for purposes of passing this threshold item of having continuing unmet recovery needs, you don't have those continuing unmet recovery needs because you've already made the repairs. Even though, had you had more money, you would have repaired it better. Because you've made the repairs, the answer is no for this threshold criteria.
Yeah, the interesting thing is if you can meet a national objective, then regular CDBG could do this work if it was part of your plan. The problem is that CDBG-DR has to have this additional tieback. That's one of the reasons that's making these questions tricky, is that you have to get out of the regular program mindset to get there.
Okay, this is a good one. If a town assessed their damage from the qualifying disaster, including the cost to make it more resilient, but already funded the repair the damage, but not the resilience, can that count as an unmet recovery need?
Same answer as the answer we just gave.
If they finish the repair.
They finish the repairs, so they don't have unmet recovery needs in that.
Okay. I think somebody wants to clarify that what we're saying is not the new definition of what mid-earn says. You can aggregate census tracts to create one sub-county area. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. There was another one I missed. Hold on.
But those census tracts have to be contiguous.
They have to be contiguous. Okay.
Yeah, we're sub-county area in the NOFA for most impacted. You should just know it should have said such as. We did allow census tracts that were contiguous and grouped together and in the same county, as a single sub-county area. That's one of the technical things we're fixing.
Okay.
And we did read your letters that way.
Can a watershed be considered as a sub-county area as it encompasses portions of counties?
You would need to have that you'd have to qualify each separate county separately here. So if the watershed travels 3 counties, each county's sub-county areas that watershed is in would need to be
listed separately.
So you'd need to demonstrate the most impacted and distressed for each of those sub-county areas.
But we got one. I actually can guess who's asking this based on this. You can use the same report and say, and point out the places in the report that cover each of the sub-county areas, because we know watersheds don't have necessarily natural county boundaries. But we have an example of one in the history of CDBG-DR where a watershed is actually interrupted by a major granite ridge, and so the areas that are in the watershed aren't actually all contiguous. It's a very odd situation. So we want you to qualify each sub-county area, because we know that area is actually in play in the eligible applicants.
Okay, here's another one. For the sources and uses for an infrastructure project, can the applicant create the sources and uses themselves? Can you provide an example of the type of information that would be required?
Yes, the applicant can provide that, develop that themselves, and all that we are asking for is sources. FEMA Public Assistance Funds, $500,000. Uses, and that's all the sources there are. Uses, repairing this water and sewer plant, $1.5 million to
and here's the estimate
properly.
of the.
And here's the estimate of that. Hence, the shortage is $1 million.
It's like a little 2-column spreadsheet. It doesn't have to be. We're not looking on uses for, you know, a total breakdown of construction costs, labor and materials, and all that. Although we got a couple of those. Thank you. We're looking for a very basic sources and uses and a statement that you don't. That you have a shortfall. Make sure we can understand clearly what the shortfall is.
It is especially true for those folks who also have CDBG disaster recovery funds already. You especially need to make sure you show to us that you do not have any funding available out of your existing grant to address those unmet recovery needs, because we can't have a duplication of benefits problem here.
Especially not within our own grant.
Yeah.
So
that would be bad.
Hold on.
Wow, you guys are asking a lot of questions. Give us a sec while we sort out what to answer next.
There was another question, being confused by the last answer in regards to funding secured for basic repairs versus basic repairs completed. If you have funds for basic repairs but haven't done the work yet, does the mitigation or resiliency work count as unmet needs?
Yes. If you have not yet done the work, but you lay out for us a project that includes the repairs, and you show us an engineering report that includes the repairs plus resiliency, and show us in the sources and uses that you do not have enough money to do them both, then yes, you have an unmet need for that project. We allow resiliency incorporated into the tied back project if you have not done the work yet.
Okay, so a couple of more project or activity-related questions, just keeping in mind that that's not a requirement, or not something we're looking for in Phase 1, but we are out of unmet recovery need questions right now.
Okay.
Question generally, what is funded through this grant, just the recovery project, or also additional things that bring resiliency to the area?
What we're funding are resilient recovery projects. So we can fund, in CDBG terms, activities that have tie-back to recovery from the effects, direct or indirect effects, of the qualified disaster. That's exactly what the NOFA says. And we've been asked, can we do a statewide resilience plan? No, because the law says that you can only provide benefit to the most impacted and distressed areas related to covered disaster. So we need you to make most mean something by selecting the most impacted areas. What we're looking for is for you to look at our money, our grant funds, as seed money, because $1 billion spread across the country really isn't that much money for this kind of heavy lifting recovery that we're talking about. As seed money, and you're putting some money in the game too, so if you want to do a statewide plan that's going to incorporate some costs for the most impacted areas, find other funding for parts of the plan, and use the CDBG-DR funding for part of the plan. One of the really cool things about the Rockefeller Foundation effort that I discovered when I attended the summit, which was their kickoff, was that they are bringing in local philanthropies and a lot of other funders who are really intensely interested in helping with exactly that sort of thing. So if you're not already participating in the Rockefeller effort, I would say that that would be a really good reason to participate, is that you can get connected to maybe some sources of funding in your area that you didn't know about that are interested in resilience if you're going to go in that direction. But our funding is focused on meeting the resilient recovery needs of the most impacted and distressed areas with unmet recovery needs, because that's what the law directs.
Okay, another unmet need question came in. Can an engineer's estimate for the cost to build a major mitigation project be used as a basis to establish the amount of unmet need?
If it's pure mitigation, probably not. If it's a mitigation project that has a tie-back somehow to the covered disaster, I mean, they're going to have to establish that this is something that's related to damage or a direct effect from the disaster that's caused harm. We're saying harm. The disaster caused them harm that you're addressing. So the straight HMGP projects, a lot of them are not going to get you through this threshold.
Okay, so it sounds like we do have one question on the phone.
Oh, yay.
So maybe we can go to the phone. George?
Yeah, Lois Colson has a question, and Lois, you're on mute. I'm going to unmute you now, and you'll be able to speak and ask your question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Hi,
yep,
Lois.
We can hear you.
Like the old times, neighborhood stabilization. Okay, Lois.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Lois.
I keep having this automated voice speaking to me. Just a moment.
Lois, you should be good. I think there was,
Okay. Am I here?
I clicked unmute too many times. You're on. Yep.
Okay. All right. Thanks. Hi. Good to hear some familiar voices. I'm going back to an earlier question that one of my colleagues wrote in about successfully tying back to one of the categories, successfully meeting the threshold criteria for one category, but then later in phase 2, we want to do some projects, let's say, in a category that we may not have met the threshold. Is that possible? Is that what we can? Sorry, go ahead.
No, you're not going to be able to use our money for an activity that isn't tied back to the threshold some way.
To the threshold that we met, even if we talked about one and we didn't meet it in that category.
The threshold is for an area, okay? The threshold is for most impacted and distressed area with unmet recovery needs.
Okay.
So, but
it's not separated by the infrastructure, housing, and environmental and all that is not about meeting a threshold in each category. Is that right?
Wait, just a sec. Yes, they are. I mean, you don't have to hit housing in every box, for example, but what happens then, because we're only talking about phase 1 and only talking about getting through the threshold right now, okay? So you're trying to be on toward phase 2, which is about projects. We're not about projects yet.
Right.
But I'm going to tell you that every grant-funded activity, when we get all the way through phase 2 and you're actually funding activities, is going to have to tie back to the disaster and be in a most impacted and distressed area with unmet recovery need. That's why that one question is so hard that we had to punt on earlier in this webinar, right? Because that's an example of a potential project inside an area that might be able to qualify for unmet recovery need that might have a tie back to the disaster, but it's not tied to, it itself doesn't relate to damage, and the unmet recovery need relates to harm. So you've got to get off this project mentality and this later mentality and really focus on, I assume you're still in Louisiana, right? Setting up those most impacted and distressed areas that meet an unmet recovery need. Get your area through the box, then get your idea or concept for phase 1 through the box, and then start worrying about projects.
So don't worry about the category so much as just showing what our unmet need is.
First. Yeah. You got to show us you have some unmet need in that area, or we can't. You're not going to get scored. You're not going to get through the.
Gotcha.
It sounds
okay.
Like
let me ask. Really quick, just a different way. So if we do include, we're trying to show an unmet need in, let's say, infrastructure and housing and economic development. We could still get through if we show and demonstrate the unmet need in 2 of 3 of those or 1 of 3 of those. We could still get through.
You just need 1. You just need 1.
Okay. But we won't be allowed to use activities in those ones we don't get through on.
You won't be able to have activities in the sub-county areas. In your case,
right.
The reason I outed you as being from Louisiana is because Louisiana is one of the states that has both most impacted and distressed counties declared by HUD and counties where you have to do sub-county areas. So you have the dual issue there. And so you need to demonstrate unmet recovery need after your disaster CDBG-DR grant, you know, in the counties we declared most impacted and distressed, which is one set of problems. And you have to get through all 3 thresholds for each of the other areas that you want to include as potential areas for you to be spending funding in later, once you get, through phase 1.
To clarify, I think, Lois, if I understand correctly, you're going to do some project later on. Once you've identified this area, you're going to do some project later on, and you want to know, if I'm going to do a housing project and I got qualified as an infrastructure project, the area got qualified because it had infrastructure needs, can I still do that housing project?
If it ties to some unmet recovery need. Now, it's a perfectly rational response, for example, to sometimes build infrastructure when your need is housing. If building a levee protects your housing and allows it to recover and you don't need to put your money in there, that may be, you're going to have to establish a logical link later if we get down the road. And it may be that to protect your to get your businesses to come back, you need to put housing in or something like that, or you need to do a buyout and move people in response to something else. But first you have to establish what the unmet recovery need is before you start designing projects to address that need.
So we may get in on one, we may get on one, but if we can show an indirect way that meets that unmet need, we might just...
change. The indirect ones are the hardest, but yes.
All right,
but
thank you.
Direct is better.
Direct is better, but the fires are a classic example of something where you may end up doing something indirect.
That's right.
Did you just say direct is the hardest?
Direct is easy. Indirect.
Easy, yeah. Okay. Yeah. I thought you said hardest. Okay. Thank you.
Fires are an example of where indirect might end up being the response, is what I was saying. That's all. You guys don't have to worry about fire, though.
No.
We have more fires than we're used to.
Usually we have more water than... We have the water for the folks with the fires. If we could make that work.
Yeah, maybe that's it. Louisiana can ship water anywhere.
Build a pipeline of water.
Yeah.
So do we stall long enough on this question to get some more questions?
Yeah.
We have another written question, and then we have another one over
Thanks,
the phone.
Lois.
Thank you, Lois.
Thank you.
Can the 25% cost share to FEMA qualify as an unmet need if it can be demonstrated that the cost share cannot be met by local government?
Yes. If it's cost share for PA, the answer is a definite yes. If it's cost share for hazard mitigation grant program, you still have to establish the unmet recovery need for the HMGP project.
Okay. George, can you take us to the next verbal question?
Sure. It's Aaron Koch or Koch. I'm not sure which pronunciation, but you're unmuted, sir, and you can ask your question.
Great. It's Aaron Koch from Chicago.
Hi, Aaron.
Hi. Thanks so much for hosting this. My question is related to using an engineer's report to establish unmet need. We have an area that we're obviously in a county that is been declared most impacted and distressed, and we have an area where we can demonstrate flooding occurred through 311 calls and through the number of applicants to FEMA for individual assistance. So we have good data to back that up. The question is, can we use our engineer's report in this particular area to state a dollar amount of unmet need for a mitigation project so that these areas don't flood again in the future?
So that's a good question. The project doesn't exist, right? So you have had flooding. So really you have to have an unmet repair cost. So this is again a mitigation project that unless you had sort of the infrastructure damaged and you can show that you have unmet repair damage to that infrastructure, then no. So you're actually going to need to show that there's still some sort of recovery need from that disaster, and it could be the housing, right? You could say, if you can identify these houses still haven't repaired back from the flooding disaster, and so we have this many houses that still have some damage, and that would be your unmet recovery need in this situation. So just because you need to have, I mean, that would be getting down to the project, like you might be proposing later on, building some sort of an infrastructure project to address the flooding as your project, but we still need to have this unmet recovery need, which is not that mitigation project.
Yeah, you have to have an unmet recovery need to pivot off of before you start planning the project.
Sorry. Do you need more clarification on that?
Well, no, you didn't lose me.
Yeah, he's thinking. In some cases, and you're not one, so we do have a couple of cases that told us that they expressly only did temporary repairs. You have to document to us that the repairs were only intended to last, in both those cases, for about a year while they figured out what to do. And the engineer report says, you know, these aren't going to last. That's not a fully repaired item, again. I mean, and so the question, that matches up with the earlier question, like, we haven't done the work at all, it's not repaired, but we have the money. Can we add resiliency to it? The answer to that is yes. So you need to find that damage that's not repaired yet to get through the threshold. And we set the bar at $400,000 because that's not that much in infrastructure land.
Okay, so what we'd have to do is demonstrate that the infrastructure has not been repaired.
Yeah, that you still have remaining damage that needs repair.
Okay.
Or as Todd said, if the housing near it has remaining damage that hasn't been repaired, and but you know, then later maybe you'll come to us and say that your response is going to be in infrastructure instead of housing. I mean, but first you got to tell us where the damage is to get through threshold.
You had an awful lot of houses damaged by that disaster, and the threshold is pretty low.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Thank you. Do we have any more questions?
So we have another kind of funding sort of question, short of any other unmet recovery need questions. We'll go ahead and answer this one. A question about a concept including increasing community cohesion. Will HUD money be able to fund some of those activities? If yes, can we help them understand how to tie that back to the disaster?
Okay, so you're moving on from the unmet recovery need, right? Which is what this threshold, I mean, this threshold webinar is about, your unmet recovery needs. So we're going to kind of have to stipulate that you met most impacted distress and you've established an unmet recovery need somewhere. If you want to do some work on community cohesion, one of the ways to do it is under planning and admin, of course, fairly obviously. But another way to do it is using funding that you count towards your leverage to get to pick up points in the competition. CDBG is still largely a bricks and mortar program, and it is possible to do some public service activities that will increase your community cohesion, but it's not the easiest thing to get at with a program that's really focused hard on bricks and mortar. If you have a CBDO involved, a community-based development organization, you might be able to get further. And that might be possible to do as a neighborhood revitalization project, for example. But we're not that far down the line where, you know, this is really an eligibility question. And we're just not really thinking that far. If your idea or concept involves community cohesion as part of it, that would be really cool. That's obviously a very good one for resilience. Whether it's going to ultimately result in a fundable project, I couldn't tell you.
Okay. It sounds like there's another question on the phone.
Yeah, Mark Thompson has a question. Mark, you have your hand raised, but your phone, I can't unmute you. You're going to have to unmute yourself by pressing *6 on your telephone keypad.
Hello?
Hello.
We can hear you.
Okay. Yeah, I have a question relating to, I was the guy that asked the burn scar question yesterday, and so I have a question relating to unmet recovery need in the category of environmental degradation. What data are you anticipating or expecting requiring to support reforestation, tree planting as an environmental degradation unmet need? What data would you be looking at that would best justify that?
So you have an estimate for the cost to replant the trees?
Yeah, and who do you want to see that from? I mean, obviously it's not going to be an engineer, but we may be able to get certainly Bureau of Indian Affairs, Forestry Department, or the State of New Mexico Forestry, or somebody like that. I'm just wondering, who do you want to see that from?
Any of those would be fine. We just say a reputable source.
Right, and that's, I guess, maybe what I'm trying to drill down on is, what do you consider a reputable source when it comes to something like that?
Well, if it's one of our federal colleagues, we'll consider that a reputable source for sure. And usually if it's over the state government, same thing if it's a state agency.
We had at least one bring in a university department who wrote a report.
Okay.
A professor who described, you know, and established that they were an expert in the area. You need to find somebody that if we get crazy and random and Google them, we're gonna find them as a reputable source.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Sure.
That's our last question, I believe. So unless there's any more coming in through the Q&A box. Oh, wait. Oh, yeah, I think we got them all.
Okay, does anybody have any additional questions?
Going once?
I know I have 4 right now in the Resilient Recovery mailbox that I will be getting to. And those of you who are sending me questions directly to my regular mail know that I forward them to the Resilient Recovery mailbox and I answer them from there because I just need everything to be in the record. It helps me keep track so I can make the FAQs.
All right. With that, I believe that we are done. Thank you for your time this afternoon. I hope this was a helpful use of your time. Everyone have a great weekend.
This was a great group.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, George.